Welcome to the Common Creative Podcast. My name is Paul Fairweather.
And I'm Chris Meredith, and we're on a mission to unpack the secrets of creativity at work, at home, and beyond through the lens of ideas, stories, and visual cognition. And Paul, I would say today's show unpacks more about creativity than it's possible for us to have imagined.
Chris, today's guest is Alex Pang, the author of one of my favourite books called Rest, basically how people over time, great thinkers, have incorporated rest as an important part of their success. So I've been a fan of Alex's for many years since I read the book, and it was absolutely fantastic. Such great insights and so many sort of connections, for the big ideas that we've had, neuroscientists around the fault network, around mind wandering, curiosity, so many different things. So it was really quite apt for it to be the 199th episode.
Yes.
To bring together so many things in such a strong way.
And what's lovely, so many of his ideas are the practical application of the theories and concepts we've discussed in other shows. This is how you can actually harness the power of rest, how you can use rest, be it kind of activity like running or mountain climbing, or it could be just the downtime you take between when you're thinking, but practical stuff you can do to get your brain to be more productive, more creative. Fantastic show. Everyone should listen to this one.
Yeah, no, look, obviously he's very articulate and a deep thinker. I just love, I love talking to, as we said after the show, whoever who's listening out here, the great benefit for Chris and I is to get to talk to people
yes.
that admire. Alex Pang, welcome to the Common Creative Podcast.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be with you. And hi, Chris.
Alex, great to meet you. Thanks for joining us on the show.
So, Alex, there's lots of things I want to ask you about your fantastic book, Rest. But before that, I'd like to get into, just from you, a quick potted history, 60 seconds odd, about where you came from to where you are now as an academic author and business consultant.
Sure. My academic background is in a field called history and sociology of science. And originally, I had gotten into that because I couldn't decide between majoring in history or sort of choosing a science, and so it was a sort of nice combination. And I think I've been kind of splitting the difference ever since. I spent a few years as a postdoc and kind of visiting lecturer. The job market for academics in the U.S. has been terrible basically since the 1980s, and so eventually I moved into the publishing world, working for Encyclopedia Britannica, and then from there stepped into sort of corporate consulting after being involved in reorganizing the Britannica, moving from a print publisher to a digital publisher. And it turned out that sort of being in the sort of business world, working with organizations, was both intellectually more satisfying than I had sort of ever imagined as an academic, and allowed me to keep working on kind of big questions that had interested me for a long time, one of which was sort of the nature of creativity and how organizations can create policies or cultures to support it. One of the things within that I realized was that there was an emerging body of research that told us that mind wandering, leisure, sleep, these things actually turn out to be a lot more important for fostering or supporting creativity generally and specific intellectual breakthroughs than we normally sort of recognize. And this was something that neither historians nor lots of people who talk about creativity nor people who try to build it into their businesses had really thought about very much. And so that was kind of the intellectual origin of the book Rest. And then my more recent work has built on that. My book on the 4-day work week was an effort to show how to scale this to organizations, not just individuals, and have worked with folks to try and put that into practice in their organizations and daily work. So that's me and where I come from.
Fantastic. Alex, there's so many connections. I think you were the 100, and there's an enormous amount of connections. We've had Moshe Bar wrote a book called Mind Wandering, and then Jonathan Schooler, he calls it Mind Wandering. And also, very early on, our 13th episode was an Australian designer, digital agency person who we spoke about a 4-day week. Their organisation had a 4-day week. So there's so many great connections. Look, let's start start with rest. I think that, there's so much to unpack there. There's a particular thing I do want to ask you about. You in part 2 of it, you talk about sustaining creativity, about recovery, exercise, deep play, and sabbaticals. Do you want to unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. The big idea with the book is that, first of all, rest plays a hidden but critical role in the lives of highly creative people, right? Nobel Prize winners, mathematicians, the kind of people who we imagine are obsessed with their work and never stop working. Turns out they actually take rest really seriously and figure out ways to incorporate it into their daily practice, but also use it as a kind of governor to keep themselves from burning out and having longer, more sustainable creative careers. And there are consistent ways in which they do that we can learn from. You admit, and these include things like designing daily routines that layer periods of really focused, intensive rest where you get into flow with deliberate breaks where you're giving your mind time to kind of relax and and mind wander, as Jonathan Shuley would put it, or Moshe Bar would. Both of their books being somewhere behind me. But also using things like exercise, working in the garden, things like this, to help create a kind of intellectual environment in which they are more likely to have good ideas, but also at the kind of weekly or seasonal level, taking more time on weekends to completely decompress, having serious hobbies that get them out of the office, that give them an excuse to, go to the beach or go to the gym or go rock climbing, to do something that is physically strenuous, that is often cognitively really challenging, and counterintuitively can remind them of what they love best about their work when it goes well in a very different kind of environment, so that you can go back to work both mentally and psychologically refreshed. And then, I think the one other thing you mentioned were sabbaticals, which happen every few years. They can be as short as a couple weeks, or, if you're really lucky, as long as 6 months or a year. And when done right, can be absolutely life-changing. I mean, the book Rest and my book on distraction actually both came out of a sabbatical that I took in 15 years ago, I hate to say now, at Microsoft Research Cambridge. And that was 3 months. But being in a different place, being able to read a lot, to think really seriously in a very different kind of way than you do here in Silicon Valley, turned out to unlock all kinds of ideas, reconnect me with interests in ways that really have been generative ever since. So that's why rest turns out to be really important if you're creative. And in fact, all of us are creative. It's also, we can learn how to do it in ways that help us both rest better, have better ideas, and have more sustainable lives and careers.
So, Alex, one question I had was, which is, what is rest? And if I've heard you right, it's a very broad concept, just everything from kind of planning breaks in your day through to embracing physical exercise, through to taking sabbaticals and so on. Would that be right? It's a broad harnessing the power of the moments when you're not working, rather than sort of taking 10 minutes for a cup of tea. It's not that.
Yes. So I think of rest as the time you spend recharging the mental and physical or of batteries that you spend down at work. And that's a very, very broad definition. If you're a physiologist or such, you could take issue with it. But for my purposes, it's close enough. And for most humans, I think it is. And part of the reason that I define it that broadly is that it turns out that when you think about it in terms of recovery, often the most valuable kinds of rest do not involve sitting on the couch with a bag of salty snacks in one hand and the TV remote in the other, but can be much more physical than that. Right? They can involve serious exercise or things that are mentally challenging, but in a very different way than work. And I think that once you recognize that, rest becomes something that is for people who have trouble slowing down. It's a definition or understanding of rest that gives those people permission to step out of the office, to get out the surfboard, to do things. But also, it is, in the long run, healthier for all of us to see rest in this more holistic way than to think of it as a kind of narrow, mere kind of negative space defined by the absence of activity.
Yes. I was struck by your concept. I think you called it deep play. And it plays a word that carries all sorts of negative baggage. It's kind of not productive. It's for kids. It's a distraction. For adults, we should be serious. And so I'm really tuning into this idea of rest being something, or this idea of recharging the batteries is something very positive. I'm guessing the last thing you should do when you're resting, when you're doing recharging batteries, is thinking about the fact that you're recharging the batteries, because that itself is a cognitive exercise. Another thing that struck me is the parallels, firstly the word sabbatical, drawn from the academic world. And I think you could argue that in the academic world, a number of practices have been developed to help academics to think. And so it's not unsurprising, therefore, that the concept of a sabbatical has come out of the academic world. The other reference point I have personally, my daughter happens to be an elite athlete, and they understand the importance of rest and recovery. Their coaches, if they catch them kind of fooling around when they should be resting, and they expect to see them watching movies or reading books and not between when they're at serious sporting events. And so again, there's an obvious learning there from the world of elite sport or the world of academics, the power, recharging those batteries and so on. So that was a bit of a long ramble. My question was, how does a business embrace this? The 4-day working week, I think, it's something that you can understand what the challenge is to adopt that. But if you're saying it's good to get out the surfboard, it's cool to kind of go hiking mountains, it's important to walk in the park, how can a business, which wants its employees sitting at their computers, pounding the keyboards, how can a business embrace that?
Okay, I think that the 4-day week has the virtue of being a really easy goal to articulate, and one that I think everybody can appreciate with less than a moment's reflection. But it's also something that requires a whole bunch of organizational and cultural changes that turn out to be really beneficial, both for individuals, but also for leaders and for companies or nonprofits themselves. First off, there are lots of small and medium-sized organizations in which the founders are actually, or the CEOs, are the people who are most prone to overwork and burnout. And often their burning out is the thing that can really threaten the existence of, or the viability of the organization. If you are the head chef at a restaurant, you've built the menu, the kind of image of the place around you, and you can't keep doing this, that's an existential threat to everybody's job and to the viability of the organization. I think that that the 4-day week is an obvious way of building into everybody's schedule time that they can use for doing nothing, quote unquote, in very restorative ways. Indeed, they often will come up with names for this extra day off. And one of my favorites was a software company called Polar that decided to call them some days, as in, you say to yourself, someday I'll finish painting the garage, or someday I'll learn French. This was not just a third day to go out drinking. This was a day to do those things that you didn't have time to do before. I think that beyond that, I think that there are a lot of ways that we could talk about organizations putting this into practice in terms either of policy stuff or in terms of better social norms. But one of the reasons that I've advocated for a 4-day work week is that it serves as a kind of forcing function that does all of that stuff simultaneously, that gives everybody skin in the game, that does so in a very fair, equitable kind of way, and generates sustainable benefits for everyone from the newest employee to the founder and the company itself.
Alex, I'm wondering whether, and it's only I thought about this morning in the lead up to this conversation, but this idea of the 4-day week, which, or even the 3-day week, which, historically futurists said we'd be in by now. In fact, we wouldn't be working by now because of the robots. But of course, the robots are here and there's a lot of panic. But do you think that, and it probably needs a mind shift, by more equitable business owners and leaders and CEOs about saying, okay, well, it's pretty easy to do a 4-day week now because that extra day, we've got all this technological support, but it requires someone to be saying, well, I'm going to share that with everyone else, right, keep people employed and not take more and more profit. Do you think that might be the the way of the future, the AI allowing this to happen?
You know, I think that is sort of what, as we would say here in the States, the $64,000 question. You know, to your first point, there are studies that tell us that the average knowledge worker loses about 2 hours of productive time every day to overly long meetings, to poorly implemented technology, and to distractions, right? Bosses who show up with some emergency thing, or people who come and ask how the game is, or have one quick question that turns into a 10-minute diversion. In a sense, the 4-day week is already here. It's just we're spending one day in the office trying to fix the printer, or get on the network, or talking about football. So if you can deal with those things, make the technology better, redesign the workday, eliminate distractions, then the 4-day week turns out to be within reach of a lot of people. Now, I think the question with AI and automation technologies really boils down to who gets to decide how this technology gets deployed and therefore benefits. If you have consultants parachuting in from the outside, helping your CEO figure out how to engage in large-scale process automation for your call center, then you're going to end up with eliminating a lot of jobs. And indeed, that's the dream for many, many CEOs, right? Using AI to simply replace workers, to automate jobs away is, it's a quick way to boost your stock or to make your profits look good, etc. On the other hand, what I've seen with 4-day week companies is that when people are given these tools and have the chance to figure out how to use them, miraculously, they don't automate themselves out of jobs, but what they do is figure out how to use it to offload the less interesting, more difficult parts of their jobs so that they can focus on the more higher value-added stuff. So giving essentially workers control over the LLM-driven means of production turns out to be a way of empowering and upskilling workers rather than a way of destroying them. And so I think it really is going to come down to whether it is management and capital who drive adoption of AI in the offices and workforces, which almost inevitably or irresistibly leads to the elimination of jobs, or whether it's something that's driven by workers themselves, which will lead to upskilling, to the elimination of more of the drudge work, and more empowered workers who have a higher stake in those organizations because they now have a better understanding of how the work works, how to make it better, and probably will continue to have ideas about how the place can continue to improve and what other things you could further automate.
I'm wondering how this idea, the 4-day week, plays out in different cultures. I'm thinking, forgive the generalization, but Americans are notoriously reluctant to go on holiday. There are very few public holidays. Your annual holiday seems to be 2 weeks, whereas the Europeans are used to 4 weeks and more, and taking time off when you need it for bereavement or weddings. What have you noticed in the States versus other parts of the world?
That is a terrific question. And when I started this work, I expected to see bigger national differences that tracked with differences in work culture. The TLDR is we haven't seen that. There are small statistical differences in things like how people spend their time or how much they appreciate the 4-day week. But whether you're talking about survey results from the US, UK, Ireland, Australia, or of other countries where I've helped run trials, it is remarkably consistent how much people appreciate the 4-day week and what they do with their time. It turns out even, Japan and Korea are hotspots for experimentation with the 4-day work week. And these are places, have had to invent their own words for working yourself to death. And so, even in cultures that are that workaholic, you see experimentation with a 4-day week just as you do in the social democratic paradises of Sweden and Denmark, right? Places that already we thought had great work-life balance and, benefits and healthcare and all that stuff. So you would think this is the last place, if Japan and Korea are doing it, that you would see interest in it. But in fact, you do. Yeah.
So are there any, what I'm thinking about, imagine a company wakes up one morning, they say, listen, everyone, we're going to go down to a 4-day working week, which gives you a 3-day weekend. And I imagine the instinct then of all those staff is to go, great, whatever I currently do at my weekend, I'm going to do more of it. How do you protect that extra day for, let's call it deep play or call it for sort of a productive rest, rather than vegging out on the couch and watching movies? Are there techniques for the discipline of rest?
Yeah. It turns out, okay, first of all, sort of people don't go from doing 2-day benders to 3-day benders.
Yeah.
It turns out they spend the time doing ridiculously wholesome things, right? Almost everybody has a sport that they had to give up, or people they would like to spend more time with, or hobbies that have fallen by the wayside under time pressure that they then take back up. And so, as one company founder who moved to a 4-day week said, what my people do with their extra day is they care. They take care of themselves, they take care of their families, they take care of their communities. And so I think that I think that it does help to see the 4-day week as something, and the 3-day weekend as something that everybody has to work for and earn. Within the organizations that adopt it, there's lots of stuff you've got to do in order to sort of make this a success. And so in a way, I think that maybe that helps you appreciate or makes you value that free time more, because it really feels like something that you have created, that you have earned.
Yeah.
There are, every now and then you get someone in a company who hears the word 3-day weekend much more clearly than they hear 4-day week. And they want to do the bare minimum necessary to have more free time and calculate calculate. Everybody else will pick up the slack. In small companies, this just does not work, because really quickly, sort of the problems with that approach become very clear. You do not want to be the guy who ruined the 4-day week for everybody else.
Okay. Yeah.
Alex, I wanted to take a little bit of a sidestep and back to rest. One of the things I really wanted to ask you a question about was something out of rest that literally changed my life, and it was your story about Hans Selye, the godfather of studies of stress, and Edna O'Brien, about their experience of having this waking slowly and having this conversation between the conscious and unconscious self. Yeah. I've been doing that for years, and I realised that's how I could write. So I realised that what I was doing in that period of time, because I'm dyslexic, and I would do that and get up, and then it just flows onto the paper, 500 words. 15 minutes. So I'm really interested in that. That's what you talk about rest, being long or short or whatever. This is really something else. This is like the pivot point, and it really fascinates me.
Yes, I think that there is not as much research on creativity and either hypnagogia, which is that state between waking up and falling asleep, or hypnopompia, which is the opposite, the state between being asleep and being awake, that sort of that in between where you're kind of lying in bed. But there are a number of people who talk about this as a sort of time when the sort of door to the subconscious is a little bit open, and we're able to not just have the kind of super creative ideas that we so often feel are kind of running around, but in our subconscious, but are inaccessible, are now reachable, but in that state are sort of reachable. And I think that our best explanation of what's going on is that there's a similarity between that state and what neuroscientists call the default mode network, which is a set of brain connections that activate whenever we stop thinking about or focusing on anything. It's something that it's so default, it can start to activate in the time that it takes you to blink your eyes, like tenths of a second. And the default mode is really good at thinking about the past or the future, but also thinking about unsolved problems. And what it looks like is that there are at least structural similarities between the brain when it's in default mode and the brain when it's waking up from being asleep from dreaming, and that this is another way of accessing the creative abilities that are really difficult for us to just like switch on and off, which creative people spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to access kind of indirectly. Whether it's through going for walks or through lying in bed and, allowing the ideas to flow, or taking a nap in the middle of the day. And I think, finally, Paul, it's great to hear that experience. And it's like, I think a lot of people have the experience of reading the book and seeing something that they've always done that, they didn't, that sort of has always worked for them, and, reading that other people do it and that there's maybe a little bit of an explanation for why it works. So I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, no, actually, as you're talking, I was just thinking that I think one of the things is, as opposed to sitting down to write, there's in that thought process, there's a distinct lack of judgment.
Yeah.
So, that judging mind, which is, the executive control, and you talk about, the default mode, it's still asleep.
Right, yes.
And it allows, curiosity, which is, a lot of people on this show talk about, but it's it's this sort of unconscious curiosity, because it is that, mind wandering. So look, as I said, I think it's fantastic. There's so much, great stuff in the book, but that thing really struck a chord with me.
Yeah, and I think that ability to turn off the editorial function or executive function for a little bit is super valuable. And whether that is in using those tools or things like writing practices where you just write for X minutes and you don't delete anything, right? You don't look at what you've written, you just write, right? And be valuable practice for allowing us to be a little bit more creative at first and letting the judgment come later, because of course it always will. But increasing the space in which the ideas can kind of flourish, is figuring out how to do that is a super valuable thing for all of us.
There are one of the things that strikes me that this is that we're at the leading edge of how to get more out of the brain, which I think is a growing challenge given the way AI is growing. But the thing that's making me smile is you imagine that the solution to that is to kind of pound it harder, to make it fit. And weirdly, the solution we're describing is about understanding the power of rest and doing these things like going for a walk and so on. It just makes me smile that we've uncovered such an opportunity in such a kind of strangely playful area, rather than in something that would involve, going to the gym, usually involves a bit of pain, a bit of sweat. This doesn't. This involves being clever about the way you switch off and so on. My last question was just wondered if you had a point of view about nature. A lot of people we've spoken to have talked about the power of, you mentioned gardening, it might be going for a walk in the woods, it might be doing something near a beach, near water. And I've never really understood why it is that nature seems to have this power. And if you walk down a busy city street, that's different. That doesn't work the same way. Do you have a view on that?
I can certainly second that we perceive or react to urban versus natural environments differently. There actually are people who've sort of taken people through city streets and then through parks, and you can observe, differences in the way that their brains react. I think that the explanation that sort of I come back to is that nature holds a kind of soft fascination, as one researcher called it. It is endlessly, infinitely varied, but not in a way that sort of requires our constant focus and vigilance. Now, of course, it's a very different thing if you were, sort of walking in sort of a park that is very familiar in the daylight and doing the same thing in an unfamiliar place at night, right? However, assuming that sort of it's the first rather than the second, it seems to partly activate some of the same parts of the brain that get activated, let's say, in a cafe that's a little noisy, but not so noisy that you're distracted by it, right? Our creative minds seem to appreciate a little bit of white noise. So, going for a walk in nature or working in the garden provides that.
Great. Yeah, so it could be the sound of the wind in the trees or something like that. Lovely.
Exactly. Yeah, it's also, it's also a very multimodal thing, right? I tend to focus on like, what you're looking at, but of course it is, sort of it's stuff that you're smelling. It's also sort of the feel of the breeze, the sun, etc. So it is, it is both a very, very complex phenomenon, but it's not one that is complex in the way that you experience complexity if you're like in a board meeting or something and you're trying to read everyone's faces and come up with a strategy for getting your idea over the line or whatever.
Alex, sadly, our time is coming quickly to an end. In fact, and I just wanted to go on.
We all need a break, Paul. That's why.
I got to rest now. I got to lie down. LLB. Alex, can you just give one last thing to our audience about whatever's on your mind? About tips for whether it's for businesses to go to a 4-day or to be more creative, whatever it is. That's your classic tip.
Sure. All right. I'll give sort of my tip for individuals is you can start bringing this into your life by taking your weekends a little bit more seriously. Weekends were designed for not working, and we tend to forget that and underestimate the value that can come from switching our work phones off for a day and consciously choosing to do things that we like to do rather than scrolling endlessly or just being at someone else's beck and call. So I think that, and you begin to see the value of that after just a couple weeks. And whether you are, no matter what kind of profession you're in or what age you're at, this is a practice that both delivers benefits and can serve as the first step towards a deeper kind of rethink of the place of rest in your lives. So that's what I would recommend for people to do.
Fantastic. That's sensational. Alex, thanks so much. While Chris has been busily taking notes for later, I've been busy doing a little drawing of you. So,
fantastic. Love it.
That's a good one.
Which is the left-hand, right-hand brain thing. I find doodling the way to access the executive. But anyway, that's maybe a discussion for another time. Alex, it's been absolutely fantastic. You're a hero of mine, so it's been fantastic to have you on the show.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
I know I'm going to get into trouble for allowing the show to run over 30 minutes, but it's been so interesting. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thanks, Chris. It's been a real pleasure talking to both of you.
Well, Chris, that was wonderful, and in the end there. Towards the end, he started talking about the default mode network, and that was the work of Roger Beatty, who we heard on the show many shows away about the 3 networks, which has also been a crucial part of my works. Very, very affirming, I think, in many ways, but also to have, as you said in the beginning, such great insights about the practicality.
I was struck by the idea that his thinking is at the forefront of creative productivity, that if you want more out of your brain, you want to be more productive, what tools and techniques are there? And this concept of rest is a really powerful tool for delivering more, making a splash in the world. And it doesn't have to be at work, and it could be in your private life or whatever. But if you are curious about how you harness your own potential, a lot of the tools in his thinking will help you to do that. So I was very inspired, and the idea of being very conscious about your rest. He said don't treat rest weekends as the kind of the days off between your work. Be conscious about your rest and so on. And speaking as I am halfway through a road trip around New South Wales, I feel very proud of myself. I'm taking rest very seriously.
Oh, that's right, Chris. You're the poster boy for this episode. Look, the thing that I never thought about, but the point that he makes is that, all the studies show that there's at least 2 hours in every day that's wasted.
Mm-hmm.
So if you just got rid of that wasted time, then you get an extra day anyway.
Yeah, we're already doing a 4-day work week.
Yeah, basically, yes, exactly. So look, if you've enjoyed this show, please hit the follow button. That helps us most. Apparently the logarithm likes that.
And please tell your friend, give us a rating. Give Alex a rating. I would definitely give him a 5++++ star rating. I hope you want to give it a rating there. Any questions or comments? Put them in.
A 5-star for a 4-day week.
I see what you mean, yes, never. Otherwise the algorithm get very confused by that. And we'll see you for next week's show. Thanks for joining us.
See you then.